Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you for this ASPI CREA webinar jointly hosted by our two organizations. We did a webinar for CREA back in March, so it's really nice to get an update on what happened after, and also ASPI did a webinar a couple of months ago. So we're really excited to do this together. I'm joined today by Kate Logan, who's the director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute and our co-host for today. So really nice to have you, Kate. And by my two CREA colleagues, Lauri Myllyvirta, who is our co-founder and lead analyst, and who is also a senior fellow with ASPI. So jointly joining this webinar today. And my colleague Qi, who is our analyst focused on China's power sector. Really delighted to have the opportunity for this conversation, to pick all of your brains on some of the key trends that we have been seeing in terms of China's emissions and energy trends over the last year, and especially looking ahead towards COP30, what else is needed. Of course, China has recently announced its new climate targets, and there's a lot to unpick there. So we're going to do that. And this week, the fourth plenum is taking place in Beijing. So another big moment ahead of the 15th five-year plan for us to discuss. I'm dialing in from Brussels, where EU leaders are meeting to talk about the EU's climate targets. So also very timely. And I hope we can, cover a lot of that ground ahead of COP30 just happening in a couple of weeks. Similar to how we did it back in March, we're going to have about half an hour or so of a moderated conversation with our three experts, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A to answer your questions. So feel free to pop them into the Q&A section, and then we will come to them also, while we're speaking. Just in terms of housekeeping, this will be recorded, and we will also make the webinar public next week. Thanks to ASPI colleagues for making that possible. So you'll have the chance to also listen back to it, and but have the opportunity to get a first insight if you want now, and ask the questions that you want to ask. I think that's all in terms of introductions. And I'll probably introduce myself to all of you who don't know me. I also work at CREA and lead our climate diplomacy work. But without any further ado, I would like to kick us off with Lauri to give us a bit of an overview of where we are now, almost at the end of this year, in terms of emission trends and some of the underlying dynamics that we're seeing across different sectors in China. Where do you see things going when it comes to this whole dynamic around, have China's emissions peaked yet? And what is the current trajectory that you're observing?
Thank you. And yeah, so happy that we got over the technical glitch. China's emissions have been stable, plateauing for 1.5 years now, since early 2024. It looks like 2025 is very finely balanced. Whether there will be a small absolute increase or decrease really depends on the remaining 3 months, for which we don't really have any data for yet, and also depends on whether you look at energy, CO2 emissions, or energy plus cement. Looking at this a bit sector by sector, for the power sector, it seems likely that emissions will fall year on year, and that's obviously driven by the enormous increase in clean energy, especially solar and wind capacity in the past 12 months, and also another spurt of capacity additions expected in the next few months as the major projects of the 5-year period complete before the end of the year. I'm sure you've seen the numbers and the headlines, but it just bears emphasizing how impressive the capacity additions were in the first half of the year. More than 200 gigawatts of solar added, which translates to about 100 solar panels per second installed, and it's also a massive amount of capacity to integrate into the grid. So in the very first months after those, all of those solar plants were connected, they weren't generating at their full potential, and that seems to have improved towards the end of the summer. The bigger question is what will happen to clean energy capacity additions, especially solar, after this year. So the new pricing policy that requires solar and wind to either compete directly with in a power market that is quite heavily rigged against them, or to secure contracts for difference in these provincial auctions, has created a lot of uncertainty. I think what's for sure is that the business models, especially for solar, are going to be a lot more varied than they were before. So until May this year, if you were a solar developer, there were a lot of exciting things and challenging things about being a solar developer. But the one thing that was very simple is that once you got your installation hooked up to the grid, you knew that you were able to sell your electricity at a given price, and now every province is going to have their own variation of the auction system. Every province has their own mix of spot markets and long-term markets and buyers. So the main buyer is the distribution company, which is the provincial grid operator, and they do have quite a bit of leeway to choose what kind of capacity they want to have in the grid. So the political guidance on that will matter a lot, and it will favor projects that get included in the 5-year plans. So the big theme is that after this period of a few years when of frantic development, almost bottom-up development, it's reassertion of planning, where provincial and central government plans and targets will matter more again. In terms of but just to end on a slightly more positive note, the China Photovoltaic Industry Association still predicts that next year's solar additions will exceed 2024 levels, not 2025 levels. This year we'll see a new record of solar capacity additions and a new record of wind power capacity additions by a wide margin. So that will keep the supply of clean electricity to the market growing for the next months and next half a year. And after that, hopefully the new market design picks up, and for next year, the Photovoltaic Industry Association predicts that next year we'll also see substantial additions, and it will keep going up from there. For wind, things look even slightly better, and it should be easier for wind to navigate this new system. But for solar, things like industrial captive projects that serve the local need of an industrial plant, battery storage, solar hybrids, integrating green hydrogen all of the virtual power plants, all of these new business models will be really important. Then just a quick rundown of the other sectors and what's happening there. Construction volumes have continued to fall quite sharply. In the first 9 months of the year, new construction starts in real estate were down 19%, and that has continued to drag down demand for cement and steel, so emissions falling in those sectors. Unfortunately, in steel, emissions not falling as much as they should be because there's overcapacity and oversupply of primary coal-based steel, and the fall in demand is being absorbed more by electric arc, whereas what we would want to see is that the fall in demand is absorbed by the highly emitting coal-based steel, and the share of electric arc steel making increases. The consumption of oil products has been falling thanks to electrification in the power sector, but chemical industries oil consumption has been surging, as has been the coal consumption of coal to chemical industry, and that's emerging as the biggest driver of emission increases and the counteracting factor to the reduction in emissions from steel, cement, power, transportation. And so that's another place where the next 5-year plan will be really instructive. One would hope that with the massive progress in electrification and clean energy, the conclusion would be that that's the main thrust of the efforts to reduce reliance on imported oil and gas. But so far, that would mean at least scaling down the coal to synthetic gas and coal to liquid fuels segment of coal to chemicals, which is the largest segment, but that's very much up in the air. And yeah, I think Steve will cover the other power sector dynamics.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. It's really quite a lot of uncertainty, I guess, and a lot of questions where really big challenges are coming to a head, right? Where a lot of decisions need to be made in terms of, yeah, the trade-offs of these different sectors, and in many ways a fork in the road of where things could be going now. On steel, of course, we also have a lot of internal capacity and expertise on steel. So if you ever wanted to have a more focused steel discussion, please reach out, and we're very happy to do that. But yeah, Lauri, you covered a lot on the solar and wind sector, and T, you've actually just come back from China and you had the chance to visit a solar factory or company. But yeah, it would be really interesting for you to highlight a bit more, what are those dynamics between renewables and coal? What are some of the key findings from the report that you published for the first half of this year, where coal developments are going, and yeah, where you see these trade-offs happening? And if you want, of course, please feel free to share any of the insights that you gained during your trip to China.
Well, thank you, Belinda. Oh, it was great to join the discussion. I'll give a short update on what's happening with coal power and maybe a bit more on clean energy. Just in addition to what Lauri just mentioned in China this year. And so first coal, coal power generation has been going down as the renewables keep growing fast in China this year. And in the first 3 quarters of this year, wind and solar together, they covered all of China's electricity demand growth. So that pushed down coal power, down by around 1.6% comparing with the same period of last year. And coal power's share in the total generation has dropped to about 55% in the first 3 quarters. Last year, I think the percentage is around 59, 60% for coal power. So the shift is real. Renewables are now taking a much bigger role in the in China's power system. But at the same time, new coal power plants, they are still being built. The same time as renewables, as solar and wind expand quickly in China, in the first 8 months of the year, there's almost 50 gigawatts of new coal power plant capacity came online. So that's the fastest pace since 2010. And also for the full year, the additions could be over 80 gigawatts or even 100 gigawatts. So it's a historic high for coal power in China. A lot of this comes from the projects that were approved in 2022 and 2023. So even approvals slowed down now, we will still see many coal power plants starting operation in the next couple of years. And yeah, people wonder why, right? China's been adding renewables and coal power plants, even though the power demand growth is not that high. So this wave of coal power plants construction is mostly about energy security and local politics. So after the power shortage in 2021, many provinces, they want to make sure that they had enough capacity of their own or reduce reliance on the imported electricity from other provinces. And at the same time, so the coal mining and the coal power companies, they have become more integrated, which gives them stronger influence over investment decisions. I think around 3/4 of the newly approved projects last year were backed by coal mining groups, which makes it even harder to change the direction quickly. Officially, many of these new coal power plants, they are described as being built for flexibility of the grid to help balance the renewables. But in practice, that flexibility is mostly on paper. Most of the coal power plants, they are still run as baseload and they don't ramp down even when renewable generation is high. That's why we saw negative prices in several provinces this year in China. And also capacity payments only penalize the coal power plants for failing to ramp up, not for failing to ramp down. And long-term contracts, they guarantee their generation, whether the power is needed or not. And when there's a conflict between contracts and renewable output, it's usually the renewable that get curtailed rather than, coal power ramped up. So even though the cost share in power generation is falling, its position in the system remains protected. And in many ways, clean energy still has to adapt around coal instead of coal adapting to clean energy. And also, as Lauri said, we talk about a little bit more about wind and solar. As Lauri mentioned, that there's been a big change since mid-year. The pace of new installations has been slowed after the wind and solar pricing reform in June. And now without the subsidies, developers are becoming more cautious and many projects are waiting for better market signals of local support. I visited one of the biggest solar manufacturers in China last week, and they are feeling disappointed with the 3,600 gigawatts target. They see it as less ambitious than they had hoped. So I mean, at the same time, the share of coal power in the system is still very high. It's still over 50%, and the grid isn't flexible enough. So the curtailment of wind and solar is rising again, which is putting pressure on wind and solar developers and local governments. And one interesting thing that I noticed in China, in the China trip, that there's a focus on zero carbon industrial parks. Just earlier this week, I think the central government announced that these parks, they can receive up to 20% of their funding from national sources. So this could become a new way for local governments to meet renewable consumption targets or clean power consumption targets. So we may start to see more of these parks acting as pilots for integrating renewables, storage, and electrified industries, at the local level. Yeah, so overall, renewables are growing fast and the cost shares shrinking, but the system still needs more flexibility and better market incentives to really let renewables take the lead. The next few years, especially under the 15th five-year plan, will be crucial in determining whether coal power becomes further locked into the system or whether it can make way for clean energy to take the lead. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chi. Yeah, I think this is really helpful to understand these dynamics and also get a sense of, yeah, what you said, what is needed. And I think it was super interesting what you said. The feedback was actually from different local actors and companies to these targets, right? Yeah, that brings me to Kate. And yeah, there was a lot of discussion around China's new climate targets, around the NDC. I think all of us have engaged in many of those. But now, a few weeks later, I think we're also kind of settling in and having maybe, yeah, deeper thoughts and more second level analysis on these. So I would be really keen to hear from you what your sense is, recapping the analysis of the NDC and what the implications are for that going forward, both in terms of like diplomatic engagement for countries now at COP30, but also going beyond that. Where do you see, yeah, things going, and what are your expectations for COP30 and China's role there?
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Belinda, and also to Lauri and Chi for covering some of the data-focused aspects. I'll try and come in with more of the political context, especially on two pieces, one being the NDC, like you mentioned, and then second on COP30. So on the NDC, I think this community by now has been relatively familiar with the key targets. The way China is framing this is there is one headline target of reduce emissions 7 to 10% from an undefined peak by 2035, and that's all greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide. 3 quantitative targets, which are the 30% share for non-fossil fuels and total energy consumption by 2035, plus the 3,600 gigawatts of wind and solar. And then there's a forest forest stock volume coverage target as well, and 3 qualitative targets on EVs, ETS coverage, and adaptation. And overall, in terms of the reaction to that, I think international community was disappointed in terms of the level of ambition. The Chinese colleagues have emphasized that the NDC is a floor, not a ceiling, pointing to phrases like striving to do better. Many of the targets contain the word over. And China's also pointed a lot to how other countries have reduced their emissions post-peak to sort of justify the level of ambition of its targets. So a couple key points in terms of less noticed aspects of the NDC or points of divergence, perhaps. First is that I'd point to the fact that there are actually some pretty explicit signals in terms of China taking into account the global geopolitical environment in terms of its level of ambition, and specifically in his video remarks at the UN, Xi Jinping said that meeting these targets requires both painstaking efforts by China itself and a supportive and open international environment. There's another document from MEE that noted that China took into account both the domestic and international environment in drawing up its targets. So it's notable to see these clear signals, and maybe one can interpret it a little bit as a signal that China is looking to push on a more open trade environment for its green goods, especially given some of the dynamics that have been covered in terms of challenges domestically for these companies and needing international markets, but also trying to figure out how to absorb all of that capacity in a way that leads to substantive progress. Second piece is just on how ambitious the renewable energy targets actually are in practice, and it was useful to hear from both Lauri and Chi a little bit on this in the context of document 136, which, as this community probably knows, changed the pricing mechanism for renewables back in June of this year. And I think there's diverging questions or analysis in terms of how ambitious these targets might be. It was really interesting to hear from T about the solar company feeling that they could be more ambitious. Some have pointed to the fact that the renewable installation figures in the last couple of years have been much higher because of different incentives. If you took the average of the last 5 years, you'd come out with a bit of a lower figure. And analysts that we've talked to probably expect around 200 to 300 gigawatts per year in terms of installation. So definitely welcome further analysis from Lauri and T and CREA on that, and whether that can be exceeded and what needs to happen to basically exceed that, in line with what I understand to be at least a need for around 40% on the non-fossil figure to hit the headline target. Third is just on DHG coverage, which was a big emphasis, over the last couple of years, but with the US out of the game and not pushing so hard on this, maybe went a little bit under the radar. I think there's a bit of concern that the lack of any concrete targets apart from from some of the other important greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And it's interesting because China's been pushing methane into the agenda with the UK, EU, and diplomatic conversations. So that's another piece to watch. And then fourth, I just emphasize that China did include adaptation in the high-level targets for the first time. So it's notable that the climate impacts are sort of making it into those conversations. Just in terms of what's next, and we can turn back to this later, obviously the 15th five-year plan is being discussed right now at the fourth plenum as we speak, and will likely come out in March of next year. Would highlight three pieces to watch on this. One is whether or not there's any sort of absolute carbon emissions target included in that. There's a document from the State Council in August 2024 that essentially said China will start adopting absolute emissions targets as a supplement during the 15th five-year plan, with carbon intensity as the main target, and then after emissions have peaked, switch to a system where the absolute target is the main target and carbon intensity is a supplement. But it seems that there may be disagreement within the leadership around how and when and whether to implement these absolute targets. Second is China is currently off track on meeting its carbon intensity target for 2025. What target will it set for 2030 that enables that earlier NDC target of reducing carbon intensity by over 65% by 2030 to actually be achieved? So that target, ensuring that target is not abandoned altogether, and in some ways it's more ambitious than the new NDC. And then third is because coal was not mentioned at all in the NDC, whether or not China would reaffirm Xi's earlier commitment in 2021 to phase down coal consumption during the 15th five-year plan period, which has largely disappeared from the overall discourse. But hopefully with some of the progress, there might be more room for conversations on coal. Turning quickly to COP30, three dynamics and then three key questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Belinda. Just on dynamics, I think first piece is that China's been tempering expectations overall for COP30. I think there's this view that there doesn't necessarily have to be a big outcome every year, and that quote unquote implementation is key. This idea that it's important to maintain the optics overall, but there doesn't necessarily need to be like a big deliverable from China's perspective. I think it'll be important to watch how the agenda fight plays out at the beginning of COP and whether China plays an active role in sort of managing optics around that, given some of the challenges between some countries want to push more on mitigation and the NDC emissions gap versus some of the grievances from developing countries on finance in particular. Second is that the messenger really matters with regards to China. I think the EU, given its challenges with its own NDC, may be less credible in terms of pushing China on mitigation and ambition on that front. Brazil, as the host of the COP, could be really interesting to watch and to know how they take this issue up, amongst other, given the tight China-Brazil relationship. And then third is just this open question of whether or not there will be a US presence. And I just flagged the IMO negotiations last week where US essentially tanked the passing of the net zero framework. And that's still something many of us are watching to understand how that would play out if the US does send anyone. So maybe I'll leave it there for now. Maybe just two quick pieces. So I mentioned, I think it'll be important to watch how China responds to this collective NDC ambition gap and whether or not they support some sort of response to that. I think China is very wary against any sort of negotiated outcome. So, in terms of how you view China's climate leadership, that's an important thing to understand if there is room for support from China on that. And then also finance, obviously something to watch, whether or not China might put into this tropical forest forever facility that Brazil is launching. And then finally, just trade dynamics. And again, I read that quote earlier from Xi in his video statement on maintaining an open, favorable international environment. I would take that very much to mean that, China needs an open environment for maintaining trade of its green goods. And to China, this is, almost more important than some of the other issues, such as finance, whatnot. So maybe I'll leave it there for now and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. You've covered a lot in that, I think, a lot on the key points on the NDC and the 15th five-year plan, and also what to look out for at COP30. I think it's really helpful to get this sense from the political side of things, where things are going as well. Before we get into the Q&A, well, let's have one last question to all of you, and please, for our participants, feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box. But before we go there, if all of you had one thing that you could point others to that should be in the 15th five-year plan that people should watch out for next year, what would that be? Kate, you already mentioned a few of them, so you'll have to pick one, but maybe we can start with Lauri and then do one round.
So especially for the overarching economic and social five-year plan, which probably has been or is just being finalized, even though it comes out next year only, the single most important thing is the carbon intensity target, because that's the target that kind of has to be there, and but at the same time to align with the commitment of reducing carbon intensity by more than 65% by 2030, that target has to be well over 20%, whereas the target for the current five-year plan was 18%, and that's being missed. So that's that is going to seem like a tough one to the planners. In actual fact, it's quite achievable, but that's still the biggest test. I think it's highly unlikely that we would see the two other big ones in the economic and social five-year plan. That is the commitment to reduce coal consumption. So if that was somewhere, that would go into the energy five-year plan, which comes out a year later, or then the absolute emission cap, which would probably go into a dual carbon control plan rather than into the big one. But any indications on those would be really valuable.
Thanks, Lauri. Yes, fully agree. I think upholding these existing targets and getting reassurance that those will not be brushed under the carpet, but are indeed quite well actively pursued still by the government will be crucial. T, what would be your one thing that you'd want to see?
Well, I absolutely agree with Lauri that the carbon intensity target is crucial in the next five-year plan, since this 14th five-year plan, the carbon intensity target can't be met, that's for sure. So the next one will be crucial to meet the 65% in the last NDC. Of course, I hope that there will be a target that mentioning coal power phase down, or even coal consumption, reducing coal consumption. But honestly, I'm not very optimistic with it. I think it totally depends on how renewables performance in the next few years. If there's enough momentum gained by renewables beyond the government's first planning, and I think they will have more confidence, and probably gradually there will be a target for coal, probably inside, not outside for the public. But hopefully, this will happen in the next five-year plan. Yeah.
Thanks, Chi. Kate, what would be yours?
Yeah, so I'm watching some of the questions come in, and I might point to something that Jake brought up in your second question, which is this idea of whether and how and when China will acknowledge that it has actually peaked emissions. And this is really important in part because of the document that I mentioned from August 2024 that the State Council put out, notes that China won't emphasize the absolute carbon emissions target until emissions have peaked. So in order to do that, China needs to acknowledge that emissions have actually peaked. And obviously there is no base year or defining of peak in the NDC that was just put out. So, and I think part of that belies the fact that within the system right now, officials are very hesitant to acknowledge that emissions might already be peaking, and there's sort of still this view that emissions might peak much closer to 2030 than those of us who have been looking at the data and sort of watching the trends and hoping that the peak that is starting now can be locked in. So I think, I would point to this as something that would be probably more of a North Star in terms of more clarity around how and when that peak will be acknowledged, but something that would be really important if there is any sort of signal on that, but also very much echo the points from Lauri and Chi as well.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for already taking away the answer to those questions. Fully agree with this, and it's important how you highlight that this base year discussion is really crucial. Also, if there are going to be any total reduction targets, what do they relate to, right? So that base year discussion seems to become really a next battleground in many of these conversations. I don't know if any of you wanted to answer have additional points on the peaking question. Otherwise, I would point to the other question that Jake asked in terms of the expected demand from data center energy demand. Lauri, I know that you've done some rough calculations on that, so maybe you want to come in on that question.
Sure, yeah, I can jump in on both of them a bit. So I don't have any better estimates than what, for example, the IEA has put out, which is they're having something like 500 to 600 terawatt hours of electricity consumption from data centers by 2030, which on one hand is, of course, insane. It's more than the electricity consumption of most countries in the world. But on the other hand, it's less than 1% per year, less than 1 percentage point per year contribution to electricity consumption growth rate. So not a huge factor in that sense. So it's really important to keep in mind China's scale in all of this, and the scale of electricity consumption by the traditional heavy industries. I have in general always taken the under on these estimates because there is a long history of electricity consumption by data centers being overestimated by looking at the volume growth and underestimating the improvement in algorithmic efficiency and hardware efficiency. So if you look at the estimates from 15 years ago on how much electricity streaming would consume, we would be looking at probably the total global electricity consumption with the streaming volumes that we have now. So efficiency does matter a lot. On the peaking question, I will say two things. So my biggest concern with this 2035 target being set from peak levels is that if you're a provincial official thinking about your 5-year plan, the signal that you're going to be getting from this is that the central government thinks in terms of an emission peak happening very close to 2030. The dual control of carbon system is still not in place. So now's the time to do everything you can to increase emissions, because then when the national peak year is declared as 2028 or whatever it might be, then that's going to be the basis for all the future targets for all the provinces. So this decision just made the impulse to storm the peak or rush to the peak in terms of emissions much higher, and I very much hope that there's thinking on how to mitigate this by getting something some kind of annual targets in place for provinces to reduce intensity and or emissions. And in terms, so the other question that Jake raises is, how is the peak defined? What does it actually mean for emissions to peak before 2030? And that's of course extremely topical. My expectation is that it would be based on having the dual control of carbon system in place. So then you're basically saying that now you are guiding emissions down using this system, and therefore the peak has been reached, and you would be able to say that before you have the national emission inventories published. So this whole thing with we now have 2021 as the latest year of data. If we're working with that kind of a delay, we would only be able to validate a 2028 peak by 2032 or 2033, which is what Jake was pointing out.
Thanks, Lauri. I'm going to bundle a few of the energy questions, and maybe T, you can start, and also the others feel free to pitch in. So there are two questions on how things are panning out on the provincial level after the publication of the 136 policy. How many provinces have actually published their own provincial level guidance on these, like contract for difference-like mechanisms? And to what extent they have also expanded capacity mechanisms to include gas or batteries. And I think somewhat related, at least, where things are going in terms of development of energy storage and capacity.
Well, yes. So how many provinces have published the 136 price rules? I think I've counted earlier, but I have the impression that most of the provinces have published their regulations on this, at least 25 by now, probably even more, like 28 or something, because I think by October, by the beginning of October, it should be 25. And energy storage, I think that's a very interesting topic, because actually, when I was in China talking about, the solar manufacturers mentioned that they are not quite happy about the new NDC target, and I asked them what's their plan. This is like energy storage is our next strategy. But interestingly, in the previous data shows that the utilization hours of energy storage, the most high utilization hours came from coal power plants energy storage instead of energy storage bonded with the renewables. Because when peak demand happens, coal power actually they can also use energy storage to meet the peak demand, and they will get the rewarded capacity payment. So this is a kind of the system is not doesn't incentivize all the power resources in meeting the peak demand. So still kind of protection of coal power. Yeah, I think that well, so coal power, they actually don't have incentives to operate flexibly. They are paid for being available, not just adjusting the output. They are being paid for meeting the peaks, the demand peaks. So that also comes with Anders' next question: how many provinces had expanded their capacity payment mechanisms to gas or batteries? I think I've seen several provinces, about 2 or 3 provinces, but unfortunately I can't remember which ones. They have started pilot projects, pilot policies to include all kinds of generators into meeting the peak demand with capacity payment. So that is a good sign. And next step, I think more provinces will join this pilot. And it's a trend. Just hopefully it will happen as quickly as possible. Yeah.
Thanks, T. Yeah, I think the implementation of that on the provincial level will be really interesting to watch. And I know you've also been working with some of our external partners on a study specifically on Zhejiang, looking at flexibility there. So watch that space, hopefully with some interesting insights on that. Maybe we can move to a slightly different question. Maybe, Kate, this is one for you, looking at adaptation and how the focus seems to be shifting, with some discussions in Beijing this week having a lot more focus on disaster recovery and resettlement. And obviously now we also had that high-level mention of adaptive society as part of the NDC. where do you see the politics changing around adaptation and mitigation? Is that also on the adaptation side increasingly picking up and becoming more of a driver, perhaps?
Yeah, no, it's a very fair question. And I think what I'd emphasize up front is that it's not an either or. And from my perspective, it doesn't really make sense to pit mitigation and adaptation against one another, but rather to look at how adaptation and resilience are being elevated politically in recent years. So there is a national level climate adaptation plan that China put out first over a decade ago and just updated a couple years ago. And I think it's notable, obviously, that this is making it into the set of targets that Xi himself emphasized on the floor of the UN in his video remarks. I think in terms of the piece that you highlight, Lily, I think part of it is just looking at how the Chinese government is responding to the costs of climate disasters, and I think also the question of whether or not this is being linked to climate specifically. I thought it was interesting in last year's plan where the inability to meet the current carbon intensity target for 2025, they put a few reasons for that, of which one was increasing extreme weather, and that being a factor that was impacting China's ability to actually meet its mitigation target. And that was specifically in that last year's plan document. So that was notable. So I think in terms of the disaster recovery resettlement, I think, looking at the last piece of what you put in the chat box, another piece of this is, the types of policies that China adopts for environmental and climate progress. And, going back to the winter in Beijing, I think 2017, where China cut off coal before households were hooked up to natural gas. And that being sort of, like an example of the types of one-size-fits-all policies that China is looking to move away from. So I think there's different elements of this, but I think certainly worth watching this piece going forward.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting what you highlight, the linkages actually between the two, right? We saw that as well when there's impacts through droughts on hydropower that then impacts energy security concerns, right? So we've done a lot of analysis, obviously, on the economic benefits of the transition for clean energy sectors, but you could make a similar argument of the costs of inaction that are increasingly becoming quite tangible. Maybe Kate, do you want to take the next one as well on what does China's response to the collective NDC actually mean, and what are some of the areas we should be looking out for that require China's support at COP30?
Yeah, good question. Apologies for not sort of being more explicit on this up front. So what I mean by this is that when you add up all the NDCs that countries have put forward so far, will put forward, there will be a gap between the Paris Agreement's target of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5, and what the collective level of ambition in the NDCs add up to. Obviously there's a divergence between countries that put forward NDCs that are much more ambitious than what they can actually achieve in practice versus those countries that, adopt a different approach, such as China, which is putting forward an NDC that's maybe less ambitious than environmentalists and other, like climate advocates would hope for, but is actually achieved in practice and putting emphasis on ratcheting up ambition once it's clear that that target will be achieved. So in the context of COP30, I think there's a couple different options in terms of whether or not and how the broader climate community responds to this need for greater ambition to be in line with the science. There's a set of potential negotiated outcomes, including those on mitigation-related items, but I think more prominently a question of whether or not Brazil will lead on putting forward some sort of cover text that acknowledges this emissions gap and also calls for countries to revisit their ambition level in that context in coming years. And we saw something similar in COP26 in Glasgow, the last round of NDCs. But I think the geopolitical environment currently is much more challenged in terms of agreeing to some sort of outcome like that in a negotiated context. And obviously China emphasizes that climate targets are nationally determined, so doesn't like to agree to anything that's prescriptive in nature, especially in a negotiated context. Another option is some sort of non-negotiated outcome, such as a leader statement at the beginning of COP, that some but not all countries support in practice. Again, I think this also depends on how China decides to engage at a high political level at COP, who they send. They've promised to Brazil to send a high-level representative, and I think the international community is certainly watching how China responds in the context of China's credibility as a climate leader. But at the same time, I think China is very hesitant so far to support something that has explicit prescriptive elements. So again, last piece I'd emphasize on this is I think the messenger really matters in terms of who's pushing for this. If it's the EU pushing on it, but the EU is unable to put together their own NDC amongst member states and get that put forward by COP versus other countries that have already put forward relatively robust NDCs and are coming at it from a different perspective, I think that also matters in terms of how this issue plays out.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message, to get the messenger right, and see also how these different dynamics play out, and for everyone to do their homework at home, really, right? We have 2 more questions and 4 more minutes, so let's take them both together. They're quite different, but the first one is around the role of private companies and to what extent they're having a growing influence on China's energy policy. The example is nuclear fusion research and development, but there may be others. And then the last one, maybe Lauri, is one for you on the uncertainty of China's greenhouse gas emissions data and how do we actually go about that. I'll leave it to you. I don't know who wants to take the one on companies first. T, I think you wanted to say something.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the private sector is absolutely essential in China's energy transition, because if you look at the current solar and wind boom we've seen over the past few years, it was largely driven by the private companies. They brought the innovation, efficiency, and competitiveness. And then, of course, later on, when the government set clear performance targets for the state-owned enterprises, their involvement made the rollout even faster. So it's not about one side replacing the other, but the right balance. So the government policy should encourage private sector's participation and healthy competition rather than crowding it out. And right now we can see the government starting to talk about reducing the excessive competition, anti-involution 反内卷 in Chinese. But the key is not to limit the private initiative, is to make sure that it happens in a more sustainable and productive way. So what really matters is that the private sector continues to get positive signals and more space to innovate. And that's what will keep China's clean energy transition more resilient.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like we should have a whole webinar on involution next time, but Lauri.
Yeah, so this is going to have to be very headline level, but so there are 2 types of uncertainty. One of them is simply, China is a big country where a lot of things happen fast, and so there's just uncertainty in the data. The other one that is quite specific to China is that the incentives for manipulating statistics are so much stronger than in just about any other country, because China is special in setting so many targets that are assessed against different statistics. And so understanding the incentives and the possibility for manipulating or distorted statistics is really important. And I've written specific articles on specific cases where clearly statistics have been distorted by targets, and this can really go both ways. So climate hawks will assume that it's that the distortions are always towards showing lower emissions, whereas economic hawks assume that all the numbers are inflated to make the economy look stronger. But so it can really play out both ways. But so we track China's emissions and fossil fuel consumption using 3 different sets of data, and that's one way of being able to see if one data set or one set of data sets seems out of whack with the others. Then that's one way of then going and seeing, okay, so what could explain this, and are there incentives and possibilities for distorting data, for example.
Thanks so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But yeah, I really want to thank all the three of you for giving us so many great insights into these topics. I hope it was useful for all of you listening and for your participations. If you liked this format, let us know and we'll do more of it. Thanks a lot to Kate and Aspi for co-hosting this. I think it was really fun. And yeah, do please reach out to us if you have any questions that we couldn't answer today. Feel free to sign up to all of our newsletters and yeah, read up on the publications that are coming out. And we're looking forward to staying in touch with all of you. Thanks so much and have a good day.